Our last lecture began our discussion of lives of famous Romans of the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., the great age of empire, the era of the immense majesty of the Roman Empire. We looked at the life of Claudius, and we will now look at the life of Nero. Both emperors show how well established was the peace and security of the empire, that it could endure the eccentricities of emperors upon the throne who bore in themselves curious characteristics and won the undying hatred of the Senate. It is this undying hatred of the Senate that makes us a little cautious in evaluating lives of Claudius and Nero, because the Senate wrote history. The biographies of Suetonius, which are a major source for us, are written from a senatorial point of view. The history of Cassius Dio is written from the senatorial point of view, and above all, the powerful pages of Tacitus are the view that the Senate gives of the achievements of Claudius and Nero. This senatorial view was the basis for one of the most successful television series in the history of public TV, I, Claudius. And it is an entertaining series. It is a series that rightly won critical acclaim. And it may be as close as we will come to knowing the real truth about Claudius, Augustus, Caligula. On the other hand, how much would we know about history if our main source was the National Enquirer? Because at times, Suetonius and even Tacitus, despite the power of his Latin prose, verge on the National Enquirer in terms of their desire to highlight the extravagant, the curious, the sensational. Because under Claudius, the empire continued to function. He expanded its borders to include Britain. Excellent financial reforms were put in place. The judicial system was overhauled. And the bureaucracy was put on a very superb foundation, well organized, excluding the Senate from many bureaucratic functions for the simple reason that the Senate was inefficient. However, it takes a great deal of effort to rehabilitate Nero. And it is to Nero we turn now, age 17, having just come to power, through the machinations of his mother, Agrippina. Now, she came from superb stock. Germanicus had been one of the most noble figures of the early empire, a warrior and an administrator who dreamt of restoring the republic. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a noble woman who stood beside her husband in the most difficult of situations, so strong in her moral character that she terrified the Emperor Tiberius and was not afraid to stand up to him. Agrippina the Younger, or we might call her Agrippina the Lesser, was rather different. She was a scheming woman, attractive, but able to make herself even more attractive to her lustful Uncle Claudius, because not only was he a glutton, but he was also a very lustful individual, and she played upon this. Now, when she first began to seduce Claudius, she already had a son from her first marriage, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, another great name. In fact, one of his ancestors was a most vicious opponent of Julius Caesar, one of the most obstinate of all of the optimate opponents of Caesar, and a general of considerable ability. However, her husband was simply vicious. He gouged a man's eyes out for simply speaking to him too freely. He, one occasion, demanded that a freedman of his drink as much wine as he demanded. The freedman got drunk, couldn't continue, and so he strangled him with his own hands. At one time, riding up the Appian Way, he saw a little boy out in the middle of the road and spurred on his horses to run the little fellow over. So Nero came by some of his vicious qualities, I think, honestly. When Claudius was poisoned with his dish of mushrooms, it was the expectation of Agrippina that she would in fact rule. Now, women could, of course, not become emperor in these days, but she would be the power behind the throne, and her son would be her willing tool. She had sought to give him a good education. His tutor had been Seneca, Lucius Annius Seneca, perhaps the most multifaceted genius of his day. He was born in Spain, and he represents that expansion of Roman citizenship, which was one of the greatest ideas of Caesar and Augustus. His father had been a distinguished intellectual and Roman citizen, and Seneca had spent his years in the study of philosophy, was a very capable administrator, was also a writer of tragedies. And these tragedies, once despised in the first part of the 20th century, have now, in recent years, become the focus of a great deal of attention by classical scholars. They are rather gory, but they touch the very essence of the mind of the 1st and 2nd century A.D. In particular, his play on Hercules explains the concept of divinity, of a man who by supernatural effort achieves immortality. And it is gripping in its portrayal of Hercules in his final moments, having been poisoned by the robe of his wife, Nero, who felt that his love was vanishing from her and gave him this robe that was supposed to reinvigorate his love, but in fact was poisoned. And his pain, and then placing himself on a funeral pyre, and as he is being consumed, his body, his soul reaching out, and Jupiter speaking, "Come, your virtue has raised you to heaven." Powerful play. He also wrote a satire, and he amused his young charge, Nero, by writing a satire on the deification of Claudius. Because when Claudius died, it was expedient for Agrippina and Nero to go to the Senate and have Claudius declared a god. That way Nero is the son of a god. And an elaborate temple was built for him. But among court circles, this was quite a joke. And Seneca wrote this satire on the gordification of Claudius. Gordification. It would seem as though temples to the divine empress had a dome shape to them, like a gourd or a pumpkin. And this is how Claudius became a pumpkin or a gourd. He goes up to heaven, and the gods will have nothing to do with him, and they send him right back down to Hades. And there he is in Hades, shuffling along, drooling, and making all these absurd comments. And so Nero and his mother chuckled about this. Seneca also wrote wonderful letters, moral letters, because Seneca was a Stoic. Remember the nobility of that philosophy? That idea that God is all-controlling, to be steadfast in the truth, that happiness lies in taking your place where God has put you, following the will of God, and never stepping back, never giving in to evil, and being free inside your soul. The Stoic believed you should not have any material objects. Why? Our possessions are only the fetters that bind us to life. We should prepare our souls for their ultimate liberation. So Seneca writes in his moral epistles. He was, of course, a tremendous hypocrite. He amassed a huge fortune. He was always scheming to try to get ahead. And he manipulated Agrippina, not only to get to be tutor, but he also thought, once the young Nero was in place as emperor, that he would share in power. So there's Agrippina manipulating Seneca, Seneca manipulating Agrippina, and all of them underestimating young Nero. Now, Nero was not impressive to look at. He was short, kind of fat. He had pimples on his face, and he smelled bad, body odor. But nonetheless, he was the best tool they had to work with. And one problem they had was still the threat of Claudius's other son, Britannicus, his natural son. Claudius had loved Britannicus. In fact, he had named him in honor of the conquest of Britain. And it was only Claudius's momentary delusion before the attractions of Agrippina that had allowed him to adopt Nero and even place Nero ahead of Britannicus in the order of succession. And the people knew this. And what is more, Britannicus was a tool that could be used against Agrippina. So he had to be gotten rid of. And Nero wanted him dead. And so Nero plays an active role in murdering his brother. There is an old-standing family employee named Locusta. She's a poisoner. She has poisoned lots of people for the empress. She certainly prepared the mushroom dish that poisoned poor old Claudius. She was the one that put the gravy in it that made it poisonous. And so Nero goes to her and says, I want you to get rid of my brother, Britannicus. And so she prepares a poison dish. He brings it in and has it set before his brother, saying that it is a special dish he's had prepared for him. Well, the brother's a little skeptical, but takes a bite of it, eats a little bit more. Nothing happens to him except he has diarrhea. So Nero goes back to Locusta and he says, why didn't you kill him with that first dish? He said, that should have done the task. So then she makes up another potion. This time Nero says, I'm not going to be embarrassed at all in front of all these people this time. Let's give it to this poor little goat. The goat eats it, takes the poor creature 5 hours to die. So he says, brew that thing down. And she brews it and brews it and brews it. And finally he gives it to a pig who dies just like that. Now he takes it into Britannicus. Now Britannicus is skeptical by this time and will not eat or drink anything that isn't tasted first. It's not really a supportive family, would you say? But anyway, he won't drink or eat anything that's not tasted first. And Agrippina's there. And so he has this glass of wine tasted. And they drink it down and say, oh, it tastes just fine. And they give it to Britannicus, and he says, it's hot. I'd like some water poured in it. And they do that. They will serve hot wine, and if it's a little too hot, pour a little bit of water in it. And that is the water that is poisoned. And he is so dumb, he drinks it down, and he does die. Yes, dies there in great agony. And when he falls off of his couch, the banquet guests say, this is terrible, what's happening to him? And Nero said, oh, he's just given to fits like that. Don't worry about him. And so he expires there on the floor, and they take him off and bury him. Well, now there's no more a threat from Britannicus. And Agrippina begins to exalt her rule. She even has coins struck in which her portrait appears alongside that of Nero, as though she is the co-partner in rule. And for 5 years, from 54 to 59, she exercises a major influence upon the government. And with Seneca, it is a good government. The rule is moderate. The Senate is respected. In fact, senators who are too poor to keep up appearances are given salaries of upwards of 5,000 gold pieces. And the Senate is respected and plays an important part in legislation. But Nero continues to chafe under his mother's domination. He just can't have any fun when she's around. She just nags him all the time. And she has made him marry this chaste woman, Octavia. Oh, yes, she's a relative of his, but she is such a goody two-shoes. And she too disapproves of all of his affairs. And his mother disapproves of his affairs, so he is just going to kill Mom, he has decided. First, he dismisses her from court. And then he sends people to sue her. And all these lawsuits are brought against his mother. Then he has people ride by her villa and shout out at her and throw stones at the villa and call her names. And this makes her time in Rome so disagreeable that she goes off to the beautiful area around the Bay of Naples. She has a magnificent villa at Baia. Even today it is one of the most gorgeous places on earth. And in those days, it was filled with villas of the Roman aristocrats. It was there that in the late Republic, Lucullus had his magnificent villa, where he first grew oysters on a artificial basis. And life there is so pleasant. It is a wonderful social life. It's healthy. There are baths there. And so Agrippina retires there to the Bay of Naples. And Nero goes down to visit his mom. And he says, Mom, I'm sorry that we've had this falling out. I want to make it up to you. Please come to my villa tonight for a banquet. Well, she goes. She loves Nero. She's his mother. And so she goes, and they have a wonderful time together. And then he walks her down to her boat. He said, I want you to come back tomorrow night. I wish you'd just stay tonight. She said, no, I'm tired. I'm going to go home. So the boat is being rowed across the Bay of Naples when suddenly it just breaks in two. His engineers have been working on it and made it collapsible. So it just breaks in two, and she is sinking down there. Nero is in his villa waiting like this, jumping up and down, worried what's going to happen, bring me news what's happening. And so the boat is sinking, and Agrippina is there with one of her slaves. And the slave is drowning and shouts out, "I'm the empress, save me," pushing Agrippina aside. "I'm the empress, save me." Well, the sailors on board beat her heads in with their oars. That's what they've been instructed to do. So they beat the poor slave to death. And Agrippina swims off and swims off. Oh, she's a hardy person. And she swims all the way off and makes it to shore. And word's brought back to Nero, "Your mother's still alive." Well, I mean, Mom's really going to be mad now. What am I going to do? And he's running up and down in absolute loss. But his admiral of the fleet, a freedman, I told you freedmen could rise to high positions. His admiral of the fleet is a very ready man. Anicetus is his name, and he says, "I'll take care of it for you, Emperor." And so he goes with a band of soldiers, and they just break in on the villa of Agrippina, and he says, "We're going to kill you." And she says, "Go ahead, strike. Strike right here in my womb. Strike." And they do. They kill her. And so now Nero is rid of his mother as well. Well, this caused some worry at Rome. People were a little concerned about this because it's not an easy secret to keep. You had all these sailors trying to beat her head in. You had an old bodyguard going and killing her, but she is gone now. And Seneca begins to withdraw from court life. He thinks this is getting a little dangerous for him, and he requests permission to stay in his villa and just work on his philosophy, because it has had such an impact upon his life. And he's going to stay there and work on his philosophy. Well, by this time, Nero is really getting tired of this Octavia, and he wants to divorce her. But you ought to have a reason to divorce your wife, because she won't give in. She won't leave him. So he says, "You're guilty of committing adultery." Yes, well, that's treason. And she says, "You have to prove it." So he brings in her slaves and has them tortured. And so chaste is Octavia that even under torture, most of the slaves will not confess to anything. They say, "She is a very chaste and devoted wife to you." Well, what am I going to do? I just got to get rid of her because I've got a really new love, Poppaea. She's the one I'm really crazy about now. Well, there's Anicetus again, his admiral of the fleet. "I tell you what I'll do. Why don't I swear to having an affair with her? I swear to having an affair with her." Good. And he does. And now Octavia is found guilty of adultery and exiled, and then sooner or later killed. In a few months, she's just murdered. And what happens to the admiral of the fleet? Do you think all of these bad acts bring him disrepute? No. He is set off with a large retirement fund to a villa in Sardinia and dies in bed, an old man. Remember our question, is any immoral act ever expedient? You ponder this. Now Nero is married again to Poppaea, and he loves her. He really does love her. But sometimes he loses his temper. He can't help it. And one day she comes to him, says something that makes him mad. He kicks her in the stomach. She's pregnant. She dies. Oh, this just breaks his heart. It breaks his heart. And of course, in the meantime, the empire is really going to rack and ruin. He doesn't watch out after anything. He feels threatened by anybody who is capable. His provincial governors are very low quality, and there are problems in the provinces. For example, Britain rises up in revolt. He has sent out very extortionate governors. Well, he spends a lot of money, Nero does. He has all these villas. He is always giving games to keep the people favorably disposed towards him, always giving donations to the army, vast sums of money. So he needs money, and so he urges his governors, the more money you bring back, the better. I don't care what Caesar and Augustus used to say about keeping the provincials loyal. Tax them, soak them. And so Britain rises up in revolt, because not only are his tax collectors extortionate, but the soldiers are rapacious. They rape the British women, and the Britons rise up in revolt and slay 70,000 Romans who are in Britain, merchants and others, and nearly drive the Romans out of Britain. The chief Roman towns of Verulamium, which is not very far from Oxford today, and London are burned to the ground. And it is only with the greatest difficulty and bravery by his soldiers and officers that the revolt is put down. And then, on the eastern frontier, the Parthians are aggressive. And Nero's lack of care and concern for the eastern frontier leads to war with Parthia. And he feels so threatened by excellence that he won't put excellent generals in command or keep them in command. And so the war drags on. very expensive, and a disgrace to Roman arms. And he will not go out and campaign. Remember, even Claudius, with all his physical disabilities and his age, campaigns in Britain. That is what an imperator is supposed to do. Nero won't do it. And so the army becomes disgusted with him. And then his extortionate governors in Judea create such a difficult situation with the Jews that a revolt is on the verge there and will break out in 66 AD, one of the most violent revolts that will shake the empire in its history. And in the meantime, the city of Rome is burned to the ground. On July the 18th, 64 AD, a beautiful night, warm, a full moon, a fire broke out in Rome. No one ever knew how the fire broke out, but it swept through Rome, which had a great deal of wooden construction in it, and swept through the center part of the city and began to consume district after district after district. And as people ran out of their homes, they saw these furtive figures running up and down the streets of Rome, the narrow, crooked streets of Rome, throwing firebrands into burning houses. And whenever anybody stopped them and said, "What are you doing setting fire? There's already a fire." They said, "We have high authority to do this." And the firemen, Rome now had a fire department, were stopped by these same people from putting out the fire. And so hated was Nero among the people that the rumor began to spread that he had intentionally set the city on fire to burn it down so he could redesign it in a new architectural form. And it was said that while the city burned, he was at his villa at Antium, a few miles from Rome, out on the balcony, singing a song he had composed about the burning of Troy. And the city almost was entirely destroyed. And it was rebuilt on a much better plan. Houses had to have fireproofing. There were, and big broad streets were done. But much of the center part of Rome he confiscated and built a huge villa there called the Golden House of Nero, an architectural wonder. And its magnificent, refined paintings, some of them are still preserved for us in the museum on the Palatine Hill. But he took it over for his own preserve, and there gave his lavish parties. And now, with trouble on the frontiers, with the people hating him, he decided it was time in 66 to fulfill his dream of a stage career. For that is what he was meant to be, was an opera singer. Couldn't you not understand that he was an artist and all of these cares of empire were just keeping him from his true destiny? And so he went to Greece because the Greeks were the only one who understood artists. And he went there and performed on the stage, performed in great competition after competition. And he wanted it done just properly. He had an agent with him, and he insisted to the agent that, "I want these competitions to be real. I want all the other performers to give their best effort." And he would sit there on the edge of his bench, just, oh, he's doing so well. I don't think I'll be able to let me go over my lines again. Then he would get up and sing. And he would follow all of the traditions. You couldn't use a handkerchief. You just wipe your face with the sleeve of your gown. And one time he dropped a line, and he just wept before his agent. "Oh, I know they're not going to let me win this time. I'm not going to win." But he did. Every time, amazingly, he won. Until finally he had won 1,808 blue ribbons for his performances there in Greece. Now, he kept getting messages and diplomats coming and saying, "There's really a very serious situation brewing along the frontiers. You have governors who we suspect are being disloyal to you. Go away. You cannot interrupt my greatness." He even had a coin struck, portraying himself playing the lyre. When he returned to Rome and finally listening to these grave concerns, the armies in Gaul, in Spain, and in Africa all revolted against him. Now, he had done his best to win public approval by finding a scapegoat for some of the problems of the empire. And there was one group that was just perfect for that, the Christians. The Christians were suspicious to many Romans. They Well, first of all, this is just a historical statement. They did worship someone who was convicted of treason to the Roman Empire and crucified. And so that you had a cult that centered around what in the eyes of the Romans was a criminal. And then secondly, they were very exclusive. They would not worship the other gods of Rome. Now, you had lots of cults in Rome. You had the people who worshiped Isis and Mithra, but they would also worship the gods of Rome. The Christians would not. Now, there was one other group in Rome that wouldn't, or in the Roman Empire, that would not worship the gods of Rome, and they were the Jews. But they had special permission not to. And these Christians insisted that they were not Jewish. So they were not protected under those regulations. And they had these feasts where they partook of the body and blood of their God. And so they were accused of cannibalism. And these were also called love feasts. And they were thought to engage in orgies. Well, they were a marginal group, don't you see? They did not belong to the highest class of society. Many of them were poor. Why, some of the most active disciples. One was a fisherman by trade. And they were a considerable number in Rome. And so they were perfect for Nero to marginalize. And he tried to blame the fire of Rome upon them and tried to claim that the problems of the empire were due to the anger of the gods at the Christians. And so he instituted the first persecution of the Christians, in which the word of anonymous informants was accepted. You were hailed before a magistrate who asked you a simple question. Will you offer up a sacrifice to the god Nero? And if you did, you were given a stamped pass and allowed to go. But if, as the Christians would, you said no, you were asked again. If it were a well-meaning magistrate, he might ask a third time and say, look, just drop a little incense on the altar and I will let you go. But Christians would not. And so they were executed for treason, because not to worship the gods of Rome was treason. These were the gods who protected Rome, and not to worship them was against the law. And Nero made their deaths as painful as possible and as public as possible, for he understood that bloodlust that was such a hallmark of his age, and perhaps of ours as well, that desire for vicarious violence. And so they were exhibited in the arena, torn by wild beasts. They were set afire while they were still alive and used as torches to light the street. And there, in the circus, near the Mons Vaticanus, the Vatican Hill, was crucified that fisherman, Peter, crucified upside down so that he would not be like his Lord, but instead take that lower position. And then buried in the simple cemetery there, where one day would rise St. Peter. And then Paul, a Roman citizen, was not to be crucified. That was too painful of a death for a Roman citizen. And so he's executed by being beheaded. But blame could not be laid off on the Christians, and the revolts broke out in his armies. And in 68 AD, not only was Gaul and Africa in revolt, but he learned that his Spanish armies, under their commander Galba, had thrown off allegiance to him and were marching upon Rome. And he woke up in the middle of the night, Nero did, and called out for his servants, and none came. He walked out into the hallways looking for his guardsmen. There were none. And with one single slave, he fled from Rome, heading towards the villa on the outskirts of Rome of one of his freedmen, still loyal to him. And there, crouching in an underground cellar, drinking water out of a muddy pool, in a threadbare cloak that had burrs in it, he learned that he had been condemned as a traitor, and when captured would be held to the ground by a forked stick and beaten to death. And so he begged his slave to help him kill himself. The slave didn't want to do it. He loved Nero. But Nero asked him to hold the sword, and he pushed himself upon it, too feebly, and the slave had to drive it into his body. And as he died, Nero exclaimed, "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist dies in me.